This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
It's both kind and rational to like knowing animals. I can't deny it's fashionable to like knowing animals.
Hello everyone and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn and I do like knowing animals. This episode is brought to you by the Animal Politics book series from Sydney University Press. Today, among other things, we're going to be talking about dingoes, and these are animals who have featured prominently in the series. In particular, the series features Rowena Lennox's book, Dingo Bold, The Life and Death of Kagari Dingoes. If you want to get to know more about human-dingo relationships, you could do much worse than start there. But anyways, today's guest is Dr Stanislav Roudavski, who is a designer and academic. He leads the Deep Design Lab, a research and creative collective that focuses on design for and with non-human beings. He's also a senior lecturer in digital architectural design at the University of Melbourne. His research develops theories and practices that engage with non-humans, including animals, plants and ecosystems, but also artificial agents such as artificial intelligence. Today we're going to talk about his recent article, From Dingoes to AI, Who Makes Decisions in More Than Human Worlds, which was published in the open access journal Trace, Journal for Human Animal Studies in 2025, and was co-authored with Douglas Brock. Welcome to the podcast, Stanislav.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
Can you start by telling us what led you to work on this topic?
Well, our main motivation is really to achieve better outcomes for all forms of life. So you already mentioned that I'm interested in forms of design that benefits animals, plants, bacteria, and not only human stakeholders. So, for example, we design habitat structures for birds in places where trees do not have enough hollows which are naturally formed. And when working on such problems, we often find ourselves in situations where human knowledge is quite radically insufficient. So, for example, in Australia, most of animals are nocturnal and cryptic and very hard to observe and study. And furthermore, always in such situations, there are some disagreements. So if we look at animals, for example, owls can eat 300 possums per year, and they would prefer to have lots of possums around. But of course, if you are going to ask possums, they would prefer to have no owls around at all. So what do you do? And of course, such disagreements also involve humans. To give you another example from Australia, so there are some feral horses here in alpine national parks, and some people love seeing horses there, but other people want to shoot them because those horses manage fragile ecosystems, because those ecosystems evolved without impact by any hoofed animals. So in spite of these limitations, the common approaches to management, decision-making, and design routinely and overwhelmingly rely on human expertise. So I already mentioned that it is incomplete, but it is also, of course, biased because humans prefer their own needs, and they also feel that they are best positions to manage places such as forests or cultural landscapes or cities and buildings, even though their knowledge is incomplete, as we have already discussed. There is another challenge, and this is the fact that most of sustainability activities focus on mitigation of harm within current political and social contexts. So, for example, quite often people accept that degradation is inevitable but should be minimized. They might presume that only the simplest or cheapest choices will be acceptable to the public, and generally they tend to be skeptical about any likelihood of substantial change going into the future. So in response of this, in this article, we wanted to share our thoughts and experiences on decision-making that involves non-human stakeholders. And in particular, we wanted to show that first, it is possible to enlist non-human stakeholders as active participants in decision-making. Second, that such approach can have very simple practical benefits, and that may be contrary to expectations that human communities or businesses or governments can actually readily accept such approaches in practice and even find them aspirational.
It might be helpful if we take a bit of a step back to what in some ways is quite a basic question, but possibly also quite a difficult question. What is design? here? You're talking about including animals within the design process. I know you're an architect by training. Are we talking about the design of buildings, or are we talking about something a bit broader here?
It can be design of buildings, but it is much broader. So it used to be the design was really about taking a chair and making the chair more fashionable, unusual, beautiful, or something like this. So in this case, we can understand design is just simply a means of finding better ways to live. Understood in this way, design is definitely not unique to human beings. All forms of life are, there is a debate about that, you can call them goal-oriented or agential, but they are all trying to achieve certain conditions which are better for them. That can be comfort, survival, so on and so forth. And when doing that, they are making choices that are modifying their life circumstances, modifying their environments, which theory calls, for example, niche construction. And through this, they are participating in design processes, or we could say design-like processes, not dissimilar to humans.
I see. So when you're talking about more than human design, which is a phrase you use in the paper, which I think is a very evocative one, are we talking about just copying or drawing inspiration from the designs of these non-human entities? Or is there something as well about actively working with them?
No, it is very much about actively working with them. There are already established approaches like bioinspiration or biomimicry, bionics, that try to learn from natural systems for human purposes. A famous example would be Velcro, which is mimicking behavior of a plant. And this might or might not be useful for non-human beings, but it really is just a technique to find innovations in the natural world. In our case, I can give you an example. So, for example, in Australia, many birds live in tree hollows, and the tree hollows are formed when large and old tree gets damaged, for example, by lightning, and then microorganisms are extending the damage to create a hollow, and then the bird finds that hollow. So in our interpretation, in this case, the tree and the microorganisms are the designers, the birds are the clients, and they can be very discerning clients. They can look at a variety of hollows, they can try using them, they can try to court by advertising their ownership of a particular hollow, they can try to raise the chicks and be successful or not successful. But if such hollow is missing because there are not enough of them, then the humans can try to provide an artificial replacement. And when they are doing that, the best thing they can do is to understand the processes that led to the formation of the biologically formed hollow and then replicate it, however partially. So in this sense, they're the facilitators of the process, but the designing is very much involving those trees and microorganisms, and you could argue that they really are the senior members of that design team.
Yes, I see what you mean. What strikes me, though, is that presumably, and feel free to disagree with me here, of course, but the trees and the microorganisms aren't intending to create these holes. There's no kind of cognitive process taking place here, which is what I might typically associate with an idea of design.
That might or might not be true. I think there is an open debate about that. But from my standpoint, or from the point of the practical work that we are doing, that is not that important. And you could challenge that position on multiple counts. For example, we know that humans tend to have an illusion that they're intentional beings pursuing their goals, but they are constantly swayed by social media, by their gut biome, by the parasites that they might have caught from cats, and by all kinds of other things that might maintain the illusion of free will, but actually they are just flowing with the current in which they are finding themselves. While on the other hand, I think it is more productive to judge the quality of success of any particular set of decisions or any particular design actions by the outcomes that they are producing. If we look at the outcomes of much self-admired, conscious human decisions, we will see that they led us to lots of animal suffering, to massive ecosystem destructions, to global warming, and so on and so forth. So perhaps conscious and intentional, but not very successful. While if we look at microbial communities or tree species, they have been around for tens or hundreds or even thousands of millions of years, and they are very likely to outlive humans. So maybe they do not have and they do not use the same evolutionary mechanisms for arriving to the outcomes of their decisions, but they definitely have been more successful than humans, and maybe we should be a bit modest and learn from them.
Let's talk about the particular case you're looking at in this paper, which is alpine dingoes. Now, I admit before I read this paper, I'd not heard of alpine dingoes. So could you introduce us to them as a population and then show us where this question of design emerges in thinking about them?
I have to say that I'm not a specialist on alpine dingoes. We use this as an example because it is nearby and it was possible to demonstrate certain points in our argument. But to answer your question, dingoes have been around in Australia for about 12,000 years. They have been brought by indigenous people from somewhere in Asia. There are still debates about their exact origin, but they're a species of dog. They have never been domesticated in the sense that their genetic makeup, their morphology, their behavior was fully controlled by humans, but they lived side by side with humans quite closely, acting as companion animals, pets, sometimes competitors, and threats. And they have populated the country from the north along with the humans, and some of them found themselves in the hills, in the alpine regions, and there they have been quite successful and they have developed local habits and local cultural preferences which distinguish them from, for example, dingoes that live in the deserts.
Why are they interesting from a design perspective?
Well, the whole alpine region is under pressure. Weather patterns are changing. The snow formation is changing. This impacts skiing business, which occurs in that area. Dingoes, after they established themselves there, have become apex predators, and that meant that they had an influence on the rest of the ecosystem, which now is a combination of endemic animals, but also invasive animals, which involve rabbits and foxes and horses, whom I have already mentioned. So they acted not intentional in the same way as a human manager would be, but as regulators of interactions within that ecosystem. So their presence or absence or constraints on their behavior will influence what happens with that region, as humans have nominated a large portion of it as a national park and wish to manage it in a way that preserves biomass, biodiversity, and richness of the local ecosystem. So the management or design decisions that can be taken in application to this national park would have to involve dingoes as one of the living representatives of that place.
What you're doing in the paper is, or one of the things you're doing in the paper, is offering imagined futures for dingoes, the alpine dingoes in particular, but imagined futures that draw upon different theoretical understandings, from ecocentrism to biocentrism to more anthropocentric or technocentric possibilities. Could you introduce us to your methodological approach here? Because this struck me as quite distinctive.
No, well, what we observed is that it's already, of course, simplification. But if we group the discourse within different communities into some buckets, biocentric bucket might argue for the respect towards natural system, interconnections, and their ability to sustain themselves, and possibly even for some form of intelligent self-sufficiency within those systems. And on the other hand, the technocentric community might be interested in emerging artificial intelligence capabilities and be worried about the ethical implications of potentially sentient artificial agents. So there is an overlap between those communities, but not that much direct cross-communication. And on the other hand, we see the technical solutions are more and more impinging on the natural environments in terms of data collection, modeling of potential outcomes, means of control such as precision agriculture, electrical fencing, tagging of animals, and so on and so forth. So what we wanted to do is to see if the discourse in those communities could be merged and also considered from the standpoint where decision-making is always distributed, always communal, and disaggregated in such a way where any types of agents, pre-programmed computational systems, spontaneously acting computational systems, or living beings like animals, including dingoes or plants and other living beings, and of course humans, could act together. And how could you reconceptualize the field in the way where decision-making is not a priori excluding certain types of agents. And then in order to concretize it, we used what is called the Three Horizons framework, and this framework just suggests looking at near future as an extension of current trends, and then medium-term future where the predictions for some likely innovations in the technical field, or maybe expected changes in the natural world are starting to have effect. And then longer term future, where maybe some negative or positive trends have resulted in a substantial change. And so this is what we have done.
And what kind of futures on this 3 horizons framework do you see for these alpine dingoes?
Well, these dingoes are struggling at the moment. There are a few of them now out there, and in the near future we presume that nothing much will change and the local dingo population will go extinct. In the middle future, we are presuming that some of the technical means that are currently being used to recognize them individually by using AI to observe the patterns on their skin or tag them or model their interactions with other members of the ecosystem will help to sustain their population. But because this will be done in a very, I might say, paternalistic way, where the human experts are deciding what is the best for the local environment, these dingoes will be brought closer to the condition of domestication, where not only they lack some of their autonomy, and therefore cannot express fully their capability for innovation or communication with the rest of the ecosystem, but also they would then not be able to, well, maybe cause some substantial harms, but also not would be able to benefit to the communal management of the ecosystem to their full capacity. And then the third, more ambitious, aspirational and longer future scenario is perhaps where some of the technical means, such as building the digital twin for the whole Alpine National Park, modeling multiple scenarios, including the potential responses of dingoes, allowing near real-time or real-time feedback from dingoes' behavior and learning from dingoes' behavior to inform what those modeling is doing, would then fold the signs that they're sending through their presence, their behavior, their reaction to human interventions, where such signs can be interpreted as feedback or directions that overarching design program or modern human design team can take in those circumstances.
So this methodological approach, is it inherently an optimistic approach? How do you go about making these predictions or offering these accounts in a way that is methodologically defensible?
Well, it's optimistic in the sense that it is striving to move beyond mitigation. I know that in your book, for example, you make a distinction between an ideal theory of justice and a practical theory of justice. It is not a dissimilar point. If our ideal future state is the mitigation of ongoing harm, then it is very unlikely that we will move beyond that benchmark. If we set a more optimistic and ambitious benchmark where non-human beings have rights or other forms of influence over more than human communal life, it is very unlikely we are going to achieve the complete ideal state. And as I mentioned before, agonistic relationships within such communities are unavoidable. Any outcome is going to be a temporary compromise, especially as the environmental conditions are changing really quickly. But such aspirations are setting a broader range for possible success, and the situation is pretty dire at the moment, so any partial improvement on it is going to be better than continuing with the status quo or doing nothing or giving up.
In your experience, how do other designers take these ideas? Do you feel that there is an appetite in the design community for greater inclusion of animals?
It's an interesting question. I feel that what we are arguing for many people, especially people working in conservation biology, for example, or ecosystem management, it is not very dissimilar. Of course, they presume that human scientific expertise, for example, is going to be prevalent in managing of the ecosystems. But in practice, it is probably also going to be the case in what we are proposing. But this reframing of the problem, where non-human beings are equally respected and are given an opportunity to respond, to resist, to express themselves in the context of design, offers possibilities to systematically resist many prevalent biases which human cultural production, including science, traditional knowledges, local knowledges, cannot possibly avoid. We are biased in many ways, and without a systematic approach, it is impossible to resist this. In practice, we find a lot of enthusiastic response from people who are already encouraged to do something. For example, if a business developing a new infrastructure project has to remove some trees, in Australia they're legally obliged to replace some of the habitat opportunities that they're destroying. And they can do it in a fairly minimal ways. But within those businesses, there are people with, let's say, ecology or biology education who would like to do more. And they are both interested in more innovative technical solutions and also in the approaches that will help them to argue for more funding or better societal support, which would help them to market or promote their companies as doing some positive innovation in this space. So not on all of those ideas, but on the practical implementations of our projects, we've been finding quite good positive response.
Now, Stanislav, we ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Sure, I shall try.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
It's difficult to say, and I'm not sure what counts as scholarship here. But I was thinking that maybe one of the first things that I read, or I'm not sure, maybe it was enforced on me by my school education, was a story by Tolstoy. It's called Helstamir in Russian, but I think it's typically translated as Strider into English. It was written in 1863, and it is a story about a horse, and it is a story told by a horse, reflecting at the end of his life about human society and its vanity and cruelty, we could say. And then if I could give another example, I also read quite early on people like Vladimir Vernadsky with his biosphere ideas of 1926, and then Peter Kropotkin, who, apart from being a prince and an anarchist, has written a book about mutual aid, which was, I think, published first in 1902, which very much tried to create a counterpoint to still not yet fully accepted Darwin's ideas that prioritized competition in the natural world and emphasized how many animals out there in the wild are actually quite prepared to help each other and fully dependent on mutual aid.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Again, maybe difficult to pick precisely, but I looked and I thought that maybe it was a conference paper that I wrote for the International Symposium on Electronic Art, and it was called Building Like Animals, Using Autonomous Robots to Search, Evaluate and Build. And the idea there was, can we have a robot that would go into the forest, it wouldn't create a road, and it would tread gently, and it would pick some sticks and branches and bring them back and make a building or some structure useful for humans in a way that is similar to how birds are constructing their nests. Because typical human construction requires a site where you flatten everything, requires a road or a railroad to bring all of the materials which are typically produced far away. So a lot of destruction for any construction. While when bird builds a nest, the changes in the environment that it inevitably has to create are much more invisibly distributed across the surrounding landscape.
If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
Well, I wasn't sure about animal studies scholars, but as I already mentioned, I find ideas to do with niche construction very important and influential. So I thought I would mention someone like John Alding-Smee, and he has recently written a summative book. He is retired now, which is called Niche Construction: How Life Contributes to Its Own Evolution.
What do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
So all my current work focuses on involving animals in design, but as we already mentioned, not just as beneficiaries, but as participants. And I think reframing our relationship with animals, one can often hear that we cannot experience the world through the eyes of another. And I think it is a misguided position. I think we share with animals, or even famously bananas, much more than we imagine. We have the same basic wants, the same basic fears. We are, after all, close relatives. And so I think working with this in mind and sharing this with colleagues or students is an important shift in position.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Well, maybe what I already said. I think some evidence for this similarity of experiences of, let's say, decision-making styles, to link back to the article, is already there. And I think building on this evidence and using it, translating it into practice, is probably something that would help us believe that something like a political system where animals have voting rights or property rights or protections for their labor are much more plausible than we currently imagine.
What are you working on next?
So we've done quite a few practical projects in this space and exciting work in the domain of, let's say, multi-species geographies, animal geographies, multi-species anthropology. Another relevant field exists across different domains. But maybe at the moment there is not enough of a critical mass of people in these disciplines talking to each other. So we are now working on a couple of articles which would, on one hand, create a scoping review of what is out there, trying to consider academic literature, but also practical projects. And importantly, which is a difficult challenge, non-human behaviors that could be folded into examples that can inspire possible future solutions. And then, as the second stage, we are hoping to involve multiple authors to highlight the weak signals in the review that is purely based on the written materials, to amplify those signals, especially signals coming from animals, for example, to then use them to map out, once again, what the preferable futures might look like.
And how can people find out more about your work?
Well, most of my publications are on Google Scholar or on academia.edu, and our lab, Deep Design Lab, has a wiki, the address of which is wiki.deepdesignlab.online. And also linked from there, I maintain an online knowledge garden on a broad variety of relevant topics if people are curious or want to have a look.
Well, thanks so much, Stanislav, for joining us for this podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It was an interesting conversation.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. You can follow us on X or on Facebook, and you can find me on X or on Instagram or on Blue Sky. My name's Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.